Welcome to the Mike Litton Experience podcast. Mike has over 31 years experience in real estate, finance, and investing. He's passionate about being a father, a teacher, a realtor, an investor, and a leader. Everyone has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. And now, introducing the host of the Mike Litton Experience, Mike Litton.
So what can you expect from the Mike Litton Experience? You can expect stories that will inspire, motivate, advice that will sharpen your focus, and expert information on real estate, finance, and market conditions. A standing ovation. And the lady that was running it for the Republican Party, her name was Barbara, she goes, "Come here, young man," right? So I go over to her desk and she goes, "You're going to be on the Mike Reagan show tonight for 30 minutes. You're going to be his only guest. And you and Mike Reagan are going to tell the world what you just told that lady."
Okay.
And it was cool. I mean, I'm 24 years old at the time, right? And we took calls from all over the nation, from New York, from Texas, from Florida, right? It was really heady stuff. It was really something. Of course, we know, President Bush lost the next day. But a lot of that came from the studying that I did of Dr. Laffer and how he was the chief architect of a lot of this that took place that created this economic boom that we had.
Right. Sure. I can tell you a little bit about his involvement with that aspect of the tax cut. So he had always felt that it was more important to cut tax rates and to conquer inflation than to change the depreciation schedules, although he's in favor of immediate expensing, and he had a lot to do with that in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. Norman Torrey and Steve Enton and these other guys in Washington in the 70s had developed this accelerated cost recovery system because the inflation was so high. Right. Because when you have 10% inflation per year, you can't depreciate over a period of several years. I mean, because the money's not worth anything.
Right.
What Dr. Laffer's argument was, well, if you eliminate inflation, you're going to eliminate a lot of that problem. And if you lower the corporate rate, you're going to eliminate a lot of the problem, because all this is deducting from your revenue that's subject to the corporate rate. So his finest hour, he felt, was helping to defeat inflation and then lower the corporate rate. And then that put all the businesses more on equal footing. And the accelerated cost recovery system became less pronounced or less necessary even. And that's one of the reasons it was tabled in the 1986 Tax Act. So, but I feel sorry for the savings and loan industry. Once inflation happened, it was impossible. All their mortgages were written in the 60s when interest rates were 4%, so their assets were paying 4%, but they had to pay their depositors 10% because that was the inflation rate.
Yeah, true.
So it just made their business model impossible.
Yeah, my feeling about it is ACRS had a major impact, and I lived it. I lived it. I was, it had a major impact on the demand that we had for our real estate.
Sure. Yes.
74% of this nation's net worth is real estate. So you have to take care of the real estate if you're going to take care of the economy.
Yeah.
Right. So my feeling about it was, and I knew people that were involved in a lot of these limited partnerships and things that ACRS helped to create. And I watched that demand. I watched here the demand for real estate change dramatically, where in order to take advantage of that part of the tax code, you had to go buy a piece of commercial real estate. You couldn't implement it on the ones you owned.
Right.
So you started turnover, right, which created a ton of economic activity. So I feel like it was a major coup. And I felt like it was a major thing that the whole 27.5 and 33.5 year depreciation schedule for residential, non-residential. Yeah. Who in the world came up with that?
Yeah. That was back in the 50s.
Right.
Originally when it started. But yeah, there was a depreciation law in 1954. But yeah, we didn't talk about that in the book so much. But
but it's just crazy, it's crazy. So do you mind if we talk about the Tax Reform Act of 2017 for a second?
Let's do it. Yeah.
So one of the things that happened in the Tax Reform Act of 2017 was the standard deduction was raised fairly dramatically. And what it did was it kind of made, or for lack of a better term, it made real estate less advantageous to own owner-occupied real estate, less advantageous to own from a tax standpoint.
Yeah, of course.
So do you feel like that had a positive or a negative effect on the real estate market?
Well, the main the headline of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 was what we call the sore thumb in the book. So what Donald Trump did in 2017 is he just looked at the horizon of the tax code. So what is going on in this tax code? What is sticking out as like the worst part of it right now?
Right.
There was one thing that was sticking out, and that was the corporate tax rate. The top corporate tax rate, which affects virtually all corporations, was 35%, way higher than any kind of competitor internationally.
Correct.
The average was probably 22 or something like that, or 15 internationally, whatever it was.
And there were trillions and trillions of dollars parked offshore.
Yeah. And he looked at the personal income tax rate, which was then 40% effectively, maybe 42 if you have mandatory add-ons. And that was comparable, to other competitors, France, England, all that stuff. England had a 45% rate or whatever it was. And so, okay, ours is, competitive, a little lower, but the sore thumb was the corporate tax rate.
Right.
So the main thing he wanted to do in that thing was just get that corporate, find the highest tax rate and cut it. That's what the legendary editor of the Wall Street Journal, Robert Bartley, always used to say. Here's what you do. You want to follow Reaganomics? Here's what you do. You find the highest marginal rates and you cut them.
Exactly.
That's what, and Trump took Robert Bartley's advice. It was so great. He found the highest marginal rate and he cut it.
Yeah.
There are other things that are, less pronounced aspects of that bill, of that law. And one of them was the smaller cuts in the personal side, and then some of the revisions of the exemption schedule, of which, certainly the standard deduction was prominent. There's also the state and local tax limitation. That is, I do sympathize with John Tamny's argument that, the really big doers, the people who make a lot of money, say in California, you should not discourage their making of money by limiting their deductions. I'm very sympathetic to that argument.
Yeah.
So I think the best way to do it would be to continue to trivialize those exemptions by lowering the rate. The more you lower the rate, the less valuable the exemption becomes. That was the great lesson of the 1920s, the great lesson of 1986. If you lower that personal rate and that corporate rate even more, who cares about a deduction? It's deduction from a low rate. Deduction from a high rate, now I care about.
Right.
So I think the way forward, yes, there were some imbalances are created. Keep lowering those rates, and then people stop caring about it and just go ahead with economic activity.
And so the reason I'm asking is one of the things that happened in 2018, after the law was passed and implemented, was I started getting phone calls from people that are in the building industry. And they were telling me that they were going to their shows that they go to, their meetings every year. And they were literally being approached by hedge fund managers that were literally telling them, we want you to go buy a piece of land. We want you to build 1,000 homes, single family detached homes. We want to rent them out. We don't want to sell them. Right. Yeah. And part of that was driven by that standard deduction increase.
I can see that. Yeah, sure.
And so that's the only reason I'm asking, is because I'm literally getting feedback. I'm sure you can imagine. I'm getting feedback from people about this is something that's happening now. And the other day I was on the phone with a gentleman. It turned out he was chief of staff of one of the largest hospitals in San Diego County. And he was asking me about why Blackstone started buying, because he receives their annual report every year, why Blackstone started buying single family detached homes in the thousands in starting in 2018. And I explained to him the Tax Reform Act, but I also explained to him that we have this generation of millennials that have PTSD where home ownership is concerned.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, because they were kids back during the Great Recession, and they watched people that they loved lose their houses, and so they don't trust real estate. So it's the secondary reason why these hedge funds are buying these properties and renting them out.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm glad you told me all that kind of specialized information. I will say this: it is true that in places where home values are high and your tax bill is likely to be, say, over $12,000 or $25,000, whatever the standard deduction is now. If your property bill's over that, then the tax reform of 2017 is not going to be very favorable in terms of deducting those taxes. So yeah, you might as well buy 100 houses once you're over that tax threshold. So I see that. I think the solution there, and we're working on this right now at the Laffer Center, I think the solution there is to lower property taxes. Property taxes have just gone crazy in this country. When you have the nominal increase in home values, whatever it's been, Case Shiller's up, I don't know, 30%, 50%, whatever it is. Well, most taxing authorities are just riding that up. So we've had a boom in property tax revenue in this country. And that's just a real tax increase on homeowners. And the only thing that's going to do is destroy home ownership and drive it more into the hands of investors as opposed to individual purchasers. So again, the way I think we would attack it from this firm, from this center, is we'll just lower tax rates. At this point, the property tax rate. So if people can't afford homes, because they can't deduct their taxes have been too high. Lower property tax rates. I mean, California obviously was the predecessor, was the pioneer with Prop 13. That kind of stuff has to happen nationwide.
Yeah. So I don't disagree with you. My feeling is we've got to do something. And the reason that I feel that way is we're seeing inventory levels at the lowest they've been in history, and they just keep dropping. And part of the reason the inventory levels are dropping is because a lot of the hedge funds are in now the business of buying property and renting it out. So it's, it's there's kind of an imbalance there. And the standard deduction increase didn't help that. So it's definitely something that we need to try to address.
Well, I'm going to say one more thing about the housing market. We certainly learned this in the 1970s. All markets that have a very close connection to geology, to the earth, so that would be oil, precious metals, gold, land. They are the classic inflation hedges. So anytime there's a question about the credibility of the monetary standard, the credibility of the dollar, there is going to be a boom in the geological features of the earth. And the classic examples are oil, gold, and land. So land is going to go up in price if there are questions about the legitimacy of the dollar, and there's nothing you can do about it. So, on the tax side, there's some things you can do, but in the 1970s, why did land go up? Why did housing prices go up like crazy, forcing Proposition 13 in 1978? Because the United States went off the gold standard. That's why it happened. Because everyone was like, well, I don't know what the dollar's worth. So they plowed their money into gold, which went from $35 to $800 an ounce. They plowed their money into oil, which went from $3 to $40 a barrel. And they plowed their money into land. Case Shiller went up 300% or whatever it was. So, if you have a lousy monetary standard, you're going to have a huge demand for hedges on inflation, and that's going to just drive the housing market way up.
I agree with you.
If you have a legitimate dollar, you're going to see housing prices absolutely stabilize, if not even fall. So, Joe Biden and Janet Yellen and all that stuff can, rail against private equity buying all the houses. You had inflation, first inflation since the early 80s. That's why housing prices are way outpacing inflation.
I totally agree with that. So I do have another question for you. So, and this is not a tax question, but it is a question about oil, which is something that you know a lot about. So in the Trump administration, there was a point where oil dropped to $0 a barrel. What was behind that?
It went negative, actually. That was in the
it went negative, exactly.
That was in the early COVID-19 phase. What, in April, I guess, April of 2020. Well, I mean, oil is a futures market, so you make a contract for future delivery, and all the refiners were all the storage facilities were full because there was no demand.
And so everything just shut down.
It shut down. So people were paying you to take their oil away from them.
Wow.
And that's why the price went negative. That I literally can't. I have an order coming in. I have no place to store it, so you have to take the stuff I have now. So that's why it went negative. It turned out to be one of the greatest, pick the bottom opportunities of all time. And the thing about the oil market is it's gigantic. So there was no liquidity issue. So you could really buy a lot of call options or whatever right then and, make, 1,000-fold money in 3 months.
That's it. Well, listen, I really enjoyed this book. I really did. Is there anything else you'd like to cover before we wrap up?
Well, I'm glad you pointed out the Great Depression. One thing we wanted to stress in that book is that the Great Depression has really not been taught correctly in this country. The Great Depression happened because of tax increases. That's the single greatest cause of that horrible event. It wasn't capitalism, it wasn't industry, the system, it wasn't even the monetary system or the gold standard. There were just absolutely catastrophic tax increases at every level of government in the early 30s. And that's what caused and sustained the Great Depression.
And that was part of what I loved about your book. I learned so much about history that I never learned in school. I took college economics, right? I aced at college economics. I loved it. It was one of my, I'm sure you can tell, it was one of my favorite subjects, right? And I learned so much in this book that literally has never been taught.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really,
we're upset about that because everyone blames the system or the gold standard on the Great Depression. Come on.
Yeah.
You had the biggest tax increase on the income tax side, the trade side, and at the local level, which was 80% of US government at that point. Huge property tax increases that caused the foreclosure crisis. It was a carnival of taxation in the early 30s. That's why we had it. Yeah. So it's the worst event that everyone always still points to. Okay, yeah, government caused it with high taxes.
Yeah. And I'm telling you, man, I am so, you know this, I'm a huge fan of Dr. Laffer and a huge fan of what he did, because when he came in with President Reagan, there were people that laughed at this. There were people that ridiculed. There were people, I heard so much about Dr. Laffer and his Laffer curve and, you know, supply side economics and all this kind of stuff. And I've sat with a bunch of people, and I mean, I'm talking a lot of people, and talked about this with them after the fact now. Yeah. And they're absolutely convinced that Dr. Laffer literally saved this country, saved our economy by doing what he did.
Yeah, I mean, I can't discourage that kind of thinking, and I am sort of his biographer in a certain way, so I really, you know, look at the sources very intimately. It is Arthur Laffer who introduced Ronald Reagan to the idea of cutting tax rates. Right. I mean, Ronald Reagan was not doing that as governor of California. He didn't do that when he ran for president against Gerald Ford in the Republican primary in 1976. He was talking about a switch where if we cut spending, then we'll just kind of have an aggregate cut in taxes. You cut tax rates. No, that was, he met Arthur Laffer for the first time really in December 1975 in Beverly Hills, and then had a tutorial with them really for those 4 years, almost, you know, kind of monthly, weekly. So yeah, I mean, Reagan became convinced of Kemp Roth, and, you know, Arthur Laffer was very good friends with Jack Kemp, and then Reagan took the Kemp Roth tax cut and made it his own economic policy in the 80 campaign. And yeah, that was all catalyzed by Arthur Laffer. There's no question about that.
Yeah, and he was, you know, Reagan was a former Democrat.
Yeah.
He really wasn't a supply sider by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and he voted for Truman.
Laffer had to completely indoctrinate him.
Yeah, and you know, Truman, Reagan, the last Democrat Reagan apparently voted for was Harry Truman in 1948. Yeah. And that's after Truman had vetoed an incredible tax cut of the previous spring of early 1948, which the Republicans, then they overrode Truman's veto. It's one of the greatest tax rate cuts of all time, that of 1948. Yeah. Truman vetoed it. It was overridden. That's why we had a post-war boom. Yeah. And Reagan was still voting for Truman after he vetoed this great tax rate cut.
Yeah, and if you ask anybody, and I mean anybody, to a person that's in business, they will and knows about the 50s and the post, you know, the post-war expansion, all that. That was the taxes were the biggest part of it. Yeah. They were literally that tax act was the biggest part of it.
Yeah, I mean, in the 50s, the top personal rate was 91% most of the decade. The top corporate rate was 52%. Unless you organized your business against that reality, you would fail. I mean, you had to make money that was not taxable. Yeah. And you had to pay your executives in money that was not taxable, because otherwise they wouldn't work for you, getting 9 cents on the dollar. And they did that. And so, but when those tax rates were lowered by Kennedy and then by Reagan, I mean, they had to figure out new ways of doing business. And that's why you had the layoffs in the context of mass hiring. That's one of the great ironies of the 80s. There were all these incredible tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of layoffs, but there were 30 million new jobs. Yeah. So how's that work? Yeah. And that was the change in assets because of the change in business models with the tax atmosphere.
Well, it was top grading too, right? Because they had to come back and completely reorganize. And the people you currently had that you had employed, You actually employed them back when tax rates were so high based on the old model. The new model required that you go back and completely redo everything.
Exactly. That's what happened. It's a very dynamic time. And so that's what I'm saying. That's when I was in high school and college and all that stuff. And you saw the dynamism, but you didn't really put your finger on it. And that's why places like New York City were faked out. They actually thought, oh, we matter again. No, you don't. We just need your particular expertise now. You will have a permanent place if you yourself cut tax rates. Right. Well, they didn't. And that's why that great boom in New York has gone, because they never got the lesson that we have to cut tax rates ourselves.
Exactly. No, I totally agree. So have you ever read SNL Hell?
I don't know that I have, actually.
It's a really good book, and it talks about ACRS and SNL.
Yeah. Oh, well, thanks for the recommendation.
Thank you. I would highly recommend it. I loved it. I read it probably 20 years ago now, but it really got me thinking about how all of this connects. Like you're talking, and what made me think of it was you just mentioned, you were in college at the time and you saw this, because I was in college at the same time. I saw this exuberant activity, all this growth and all this, expansion, right? But I didn't quite put together how it happened.
Oh no, I didn't for years.
And that actually, that book, actually, a big part of that book was that explanation that I gave that lady that day, where we were talking about why we were in the savings and loan crisis we were in, because we were in a legitimate, in 1992, we were in the throes of it.
Oh,
it was bad, really bad, right?
Yeah, it was very bad.
And the Clinton campaign did an effective job of laying it basically at the feet of then President Bush, who was vice president, right? And it was a big part of why they won. The Bush campaign didn't respond to it.
Well, I've read the memos in the Bush library that Bush had on the savings and loan crisis, like from Larry Lindsay, who was on his CEA, I guess. Lindsay's memos were excellent. I mean, he just completely nailed to the president what's going on in the savings and loan industry. Yeah. He's like, they had assets. They're a highly regulated industry. They had assets that paid before, they're locked in 20-year mortgages before the hyperinflation of the 70s started. And so those assets are paying nowhere near the kind of rate that their depositors want. Yeah. So there was deregulation in the early 80s to permit them to go into asset classes that might meet the interest rate requirements of their depositors. And they couldn't really find them because they were new at this and they bought stuff they didn't know how to deal with, and then they went under. And so just forget about it. Let's just have an economic boom with low tax rates. And what did George H.W. Bush do? He raised tax rates.
Yeah.
So
after no new taxes, read my lips, right?
Yeah. And all the savings and loans were FDR. I mean, that's the New Deal. You don't even need them. I mean, so
yeah, it was really short-sighted on his part. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I totally agree. Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to cover?
Just, I'm glad you mentioned the 50s. We had a lot of fun writing the chapter on the 50s because the whole thing was just tax deductions. Everything.
I can imagine you had an absolute ball writing this book, period. Because it really was a great read. And, I highly recommend it. I probably have helped you sell some books because I'm telling people about how much I loved it and everything that I was learning from it. I mean, there are a lot of things in this book that never made it to our history books, never made it to our economic texts.
That's why I wrote the book.
We never hear about it. We never hear about it. It didn't, I went to college. I wasn't taught this.
No, we're out there on the frontier somewhere, just like writing. You forget about the academic history. They're just not writing about this.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. So I really, really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're incredibly busy. Will you tell Dr. Laffer I said hi?
We'll do that right now.
I appreciate it, buddy. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being on the Mike Litton Experience.
Thanks, Mike. It's great.
Appreciate you, Doctor. We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Mike Litton Experience. If you did, do us a favor, smash that subscribe button, tell your friends, family, and coworkers about our program, and wherever you get your podcasts, please leave us a rating. It helps us to connect with quality people just like you.
And that's a wrap. Another episode of the Mike Litton Experience in the books. Reach out to Mike on Instagram at Litton Realty. Want to meet with Mike? Check out Calendly.com/Rio760.